It's called interim release because it means you're released until trial or released until the judges should decide otherwise. It's a right of every suspect to be released because every suspect, until proven guilty, is in fact innocent. However, on the basis of the reasonable grounds standard, there are certain factors which the judges of the court will argue militate against interim release, and there are three recognized risk factors. Those factors are, first of all, the risk of flight, secondly, the risk of interference with witnesses and evidence, and thirdly, the risk of continuing to commit crimes. Okay, now obviously being in prison, no longer being in a position of power, no longer having access to the instruments of power, the former president has absolutely no means to commit crimes. Not that he ever committed crimes, because we believe that he was innocent anyway. But regarding the risk of flight, well, he's 80 years old. He's tired. He's not going anywhere. He's probably one of the most famous people on the planet. It would be impossible for him to flee and for him to hide anywhere. And as for the risk of threatening witnesses, well, we have strong grounds to argue that that would never take place anyway. And let's face it, there have been Senate hearings where people have come, they've made these allegations in the past against the former president, and absolutely nothing has happened to them. So there's no concrete risk whatsoever of a threat to witnesses. All the risk factors that exist can be adequately neutralized. However, that's not the end of the story. In order for someone to be released at the International Criminal Court, there is a need for a host state to receive him. And we have undergone negotiations, created for reasons which will become apparent in due course. And we have another state which is currently contemplated by the court and by the prosecution. The prosecution object, and it's for the judges to decide. Unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to mention names of countries for the simple reason that the matter is subject to confidential litigation. He would be able to come back to the Philippines if the Philippines were amenable to receive him. The prosecution would probably object, and they would object because they would say that some of their witnesses, presumably, are in the Philippines, or some of the victims' families are still in the Philippines, so they would vehemently object. So would the victims object, and the victims, unfortunately, have a exaggerated role sometimes in the process. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a role in the process. Of course, they should have the right to say what they believe and express their concerns, but they shouldn't dictate the course of the proceedings. That is for the prosecution and the defense. However, yes, he has a right to return to the Philippines, and I ideally wish he would return to the Philippines. In fact, if the current authorities in the Philippines were amenable to that, I would be on the first plane out and willing to discuss it with them. I'm not going to talk about active options or non-active options because it dictates to the judges. As I said, interim release applications and the receiving states are, as a rule, confidential. So I'm not going to comment one way or the other. I'm just saying that the possibility, theoretical or not, exists for someone to be interim released to the country from where he comes and from where the crimes allegedly were committed. As I said, allegedly were committed, so long as the prosecution and the judges agree to it. Yes. Well, the confirmation of charges hearing is basically the second stage in the criminal process at the International Criminal Court. The first stage is the part of the process where the defense really has no role. That's the issuance of an arrest warrant. And an arrest warrant is issued on the basis of a reasonable suspicion, namely that the judges have reasonable grounds to believe that the suspect, in this case the former president, committed a criminal offence. The second stage of the criminal process is after disclosure has taken place. That is, disclosure of the prosecution's evidence, and then the judges believe that the former president committed the crimes that he's accused of. And then obviously the third stage of the process, if we get beyond the confirmation of charges, which is when the judges examine the substantial grounds to believe, the third stage of the process is the trial. And we all know that you can only be convicted at the criminal court, International Criminal Court, if beyond a reasonable doubt, if there's evidence to show that crimes have been committed beyond a reasonable doubt. So really we are at the middle stage of the process now. We've been disclosed the prosecution's evidence and we're beginning to learn it. As I said, it's a lot of evidence. something like 2,000 items of evidence, even more, and each item of evidence contains up to 100 pages of evidence. We approached this exercise using information technology. The court has its own systems. We're all experienced in managing databases. We have to be in order to assess the evidence and to analyze it and to be able to counter it at the confirmation of charges proceedings. The evidence falls broadly into two categories. You have documentary evidence, open source media evidence. Basically, that would be the speeches that the former president gave, which the prosecution are relying on. And then there's the evidence which is derived from witnesses. Now, there are two forms of witnesses, two principal forms of witnesses. You have witnesses who are family members of victims or alleged victims. I say alleged victims because it's the prosecution who has to prove whether or not crimes were committed, not the defense to disprove. And then the second, obviously, category of documentary evidence or testimonial evidence would be that deriving from former, let's say, hitmen, people who allegedly carried out the extrajudicial killings. The prosecution will not be bringing any witnesses. They've already declared that. They're not bringing any witnesses at confirmation. And from a defense perspective, it would be a mistake to present witnesses at confirmation in order to challenge the prosecution's evidence, for the simple reason that you wouldn't want to disclose your cards so early on in the game. Obviously, if charges are confirmed, you would want to maintain an element of surprise. As I've already said, it's not for the defense to disprove charges, it's for the prosecution to prove the charges. We call that the evidentiary burden. There is a possibility. As I said, the test is, are there substantial grounds to believe that the former president committed the crimes which he's accused of? That is a lower standard than the standard at trial, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. So, on the basis of the evidence that we've had to disclose to us, we can argue that various crucial elements of the crimes have not been made out on the substantial grounds standard and ask for the case to be dismissed. And that's what we will attempt to do. Very cautious about talking prospects. I know that my team and I have done the best we possibly can, and we're hoping for the best possible result. And obviously the best possible result would be that this case would not go beyond the confirmation stage of proceedings. However, we're up against a prosecution, we're up against a strong prosecution, I may say, which has been investigating this case for the best part of 5 years. They've accumulated a huge amount of evidence. So to a certain degree, they have an advantage on the defense. That doesn't mean that the defense is not able to analyze the evidence which has been disclosed with a fine-tooth comb and find, shall we say, loopholes or mistakes or things that haven't been properly investigated. That's our job. We're there to make sure that if the charges are confirmed, they're confirmed for the right reasons and not for the wrong reasons.